Well, good afternoon. Hope you're having a good conference. My name is Dilip Kumar, and I'm a vice president at Amazon. Generative AI has captured the imagination of almost every industry and every company worldwide. But along the way, it's also raised some interesting questions of how best to get the most value out of the myriad projects that companies are doing. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I want to give you at least a brief idea of the way that Amazon's thinking about it, how the challenges that we have for launching this for our own software, as well as helping it for our own company, for the other companies that we work with. So stay tuned. The good news is that Amazon has had this long history for about 25 years of building machine learning applications. From the very early days of personalization and collaborative filtering to the more recent applications of Just Walk Out, where you can just walk in, take whatever you want, and just leave. We've been working on aspects of generative AI. So in Just Walk Out, one of the things that we've been doing is this idea of being able to create synthetic data to generate millions of shopping sessions that allows us to be able to test for the various shopping conditions that can happen in order to be able to get the right level of accuracy. And most recently, we released a shopping assistant called Rufus, which is trained on the entire community, the catalog, the product, the recommendations that so many customers have submitted over many years to be able to perform the perfect shopping assistant for you. From the time that you place an order on Amazon to the first time that it actually arrives at your front porch, every single aspect of the retail value chain, supply chain, the middle mile, the last mile, including the fulfillment centers to pick, pack, and ship, is not untouched by some aspect of machine learning and AI. But no matter what your industry is, no matter what your subject area is, no matter what your domain is, there are three distinct phases that we've actually looked at this from every single thing that we've done, even at Amazon, and what our customers are going through. And I sort of describe this in this notion of move, build, and scale. And I want to sort of take some time to describe what happens in these phases. The first phase, as you can sort of imagine, is just the idea that it's important to get started. I see a lot of analysis paralysis, or there's a lot of questioning on where should we start, what are the specific applications that we should work on. And it turns out that companies, there is a treasure trove of potential areas that you could be applying AI to. You could be applying AI to improve your customer experiences directly, or to improve your employee productivity, enhance creativity and content generation use cases, as well as process improvements, because there's many, many different areas and different departments where process improvement is a very key ask, and where this generative AI is very, very applicable. But then the question typically starts, how do you select a particular project? And I'll choose two different extremes. When you look at the various dimensions that we chose, one school of thought is it's new. Let's choose an area that isn't as risky, that has less business impact potentially. The risks of being able to sort of do this project are also lower, but also the impact that you're going to get is lower. But the organizational readiness and the time to value is also shorter. So you know that you're going to be able to show momentum. You know that you're going to be able to show progress. But the general idea is that because you're selectively choosing an area that doesn't necessarily have as much business impact, the outcome, even if you exceed really well on it, is not going to be stellar. So that's one area. The other area is choosing somewhere where your business impact is significantly higher, but the risks associated are also higher. The guardrails necessary are higher. The customer impact is higher. So you need to be a lot more thoughtful. Your organizational readiness to be able to deliver on this may not be as high as you need it to be. And you need to be able to make sure that you actually take the time to be able to get this to a level that is ready for your customers. Again, if you went through all the steps and you did all of those well, the business impact is significantly higher. But of course, there's trade-offs because the time to realize value also changes. And so the way that we sort of thought about it in terms of for choosing projects at Amazon or for what we recommend to our customers is that there's several areas here, and they're all slightly related. I'll take a couple and sort of explain one. When we think about leadership buy-in, the general image that sort of conjures to mind is this notion of, well, the sponsoring organization that's doing this project and that management chain is what's necessary to be able to bless it, to be able to make sure that they are comfortable with what you're delivering. But it's actually more beyond that. A lot of generative AI projects tend to have implicit questions about where is the data being stored, who's using it, how is it getting used, are there going to be hallucinations if you're going to be exposing it to customers. So legal tends to get involved in it, security tends to get involved in it, and these are all very good things to be able to do because you are generating and creating something with the right stakeholders very early on in the process. More so with generative AI than the others, largely because of the nature of a probabilistic output in some of these responses and how do you sort of impose the right guardrails to be able to create the right responses is very useful to be able to make sure that the right folks have the buy-in here. I'll talk a little bit about the tools part of it. By tools here, what I mean is one of the things that we've seen that has been really helpful for us is allowing the ability for the developers in your company or the engineers in your company to be able to try and test. And not just for engineers, but also creating these things at different abstract levels so that your engineers could be writing software against it to be able to try our projects to know how they work, but also business people can actually interact with it to be able to create value out of it. One of the things that we tend to do is that we tend to constrain sometimes the set of people who can build projects or to be able to get value out of it. In almost all those cases, it turns out that you're constraining productivity or you're constraining creativity in general in your organization. And so building these tools with these guardrails, with the security and privacy in mind, allows a lot more experimentation to happen simultaneously, which is then again beneficial because then you can get a subset of those will get to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. Which brings us back to the build. The build part of it is kind of interesting in the sense that this is the way that gets the most amount of attention. One of the things that I started this presentation with was saying that generative AI is raising a lot of questions as well on the efficacy and the types of projects that are very suitable for it. But one question that tends to come up again and again, which has been pretty conclusively answered, is this notion that previously people used to think that there could be one model that would generally categorize all your problems. And it's turned out again and again that that's not really true because your domains are very different. Your operational characteristics of what you care about, whether you care about latency or cost or the specific operational characteristics of your application are highly varied. And because your use cases are varied, a singular model solving all of that is also not necessarily something that has been prudent. And it's proven out again and again. I'll give you some examples of that. For example, let's take the example of customer support. Customer support is one of those very generic use cases that spreads across different industries, different segments. But the general idea is when a call comes in, there are use cases that say, well, I just want to be able to summarize this content. I have several call center agents. I want a subset of these calls that are coming in summarized so that a supervisor can look at them and be able to provide feedback and to know when things are working or not working. Well, your choices in those cases are you're not really thinking about something that needs to be latent. It doesn't need to be real time, but it needs to be sufficiently low cost, and it needs to be able to summarize content really well. So you may end up choosing a very different model. But if you're trying to do something which is a direct customer engagement or something which either uses multimodal or you're directly talking to a customer, latency becomes really important. You need the ability to be able to understand because no customer actually says the same thing in the same way. So your ability to be able to decipher the intent of what they're asking and to be able to transform it, to be able to give them an intelligent response is going to be really critical. And so your choice of application determine, even for us, we have so many things. The things that we do in supply chain are very different from the things that we do for customer service, which is very different from the things that we're actually doing on the website. And in all of these cases, we have noticed that the specific model that you use for the types of use cases has a dramatic improvement in results of what you can get from what you're trying to do. And it all comes down to one particular aspect, which is of no surprise, is this notion that the reason that these things become important is not just because of the models, but because of the data that exists specifically in your organization. And there's many examples of things that are bad, but I'll give you some general examples of how these things manifest itself. Data in organizations tend to take on the characteristics of the organization that your companies typically have. And by the way, we're not immune to this in any shape or form. Our customer service organization is in our operations as well, and our marketing is in a completely different place, but they don't necessarily share the type of data. So when a customer calls in, they're expecting to know exactly their prior interactions with you, what they have actually done, whether they're happy or they're not happy. But your proactive communications with your customers sometimes don't take care of some of those things. And so the idea that your data needs to be timely, unique, complete, and accurate are things that we take for granted, but you generally realize that unless you fix the data silos that exist in companies, it is actually very hard to be able to get practical value out of any generative AI project. There's specific things that there's many techniques of RAG and fine-tuning and continued pre-training, but it's useful for us to be able to try to explain that like with an example. Like if I were to go back to the same example of customer support, when a call comes in, as I said, customers tend to be asking these questions in very different ways. And one of the ways that you want to be able to translate that is that you want to be able to rewrite the query and rewrite the prompt in a way that is understandable, and it helps the LLM to be able to retrieve the right answer. So your specific use case, you'll be choosing models for summarizing and call summarization and categorization, which is very different. But the reason that those models work really well is because you can actually rewrite the query to be able to conform to the kinds of things that gives you the best results. Take the example of a RAG. The reason that RAGs became very popular is that again, for the same customer service agent, you don't want the customer service agent to be ad-libbing or to be able to create content on the fly. So if you had policy documents or a lot of content that allows them to be able to get this information very quickly, if someone's calling in about cancellation policies for a rental car, you just don't want them to be able to sort of give them creative answers. You want them to be able to give them the answers that the company has authorized or recommended that they give to the customer. But the ability to be able to find the right content, to be able to retrieve it, and to be able to place it in a way so that the agent knows what the next best action is, all of that becomes increasingly important and is made possible with very specific fine-tuning and RAG that we've sort of worked on. The fine-tuning aspect is, the classic example for fine-tuning is when you're trying to create content, but you want to be able to constrain that content with very specific characteristics that your brand cares about. You're trying to create marketing content, but you want it to be in your brand voice. You want it to be something that your customers care about. You want it to adhere to certain guidelines. Your guidelines could be by country, it could be by region, it could be by different types of industries. All of that results in fine-tuning where you're using your data. It doesn't go back to train the original model, but it's actually using your data to be able to train your content. And then the last one, the continued pre-training, it seems very simple, but it's actually very interesting, and it's a very challenging problem, largely because as your business changes, knowing how to be able to add incremental data and to be able to train it in a very efficient manner continues to be a very important challenge because the efficacy of the results that you're generating are largely dependent on the latency at which you can train your models as quickly as possible with any incremental information that your business is creating so that your agents or your customers or your employees get the most up-to-date answers. When we look at cost and ROI, when we went from the move phase to the build phase, one of the things that we try to sort of look at is that in the early phases, we tend to sacrifice, if we were very particular about maintaining cost, accuracy, and speed at the earliest part of this life cycle, very few of these things would get started. Eventually, when things need to go to production, you need to be able to get to a point where you have this good trade-off between these things. But the general idea is that during the move phase, during the early phases of prototyping, you're sacrificing costs. You tend to focus a lot on accuracy. You tend to focus a lot on making sure that the latency characteristics match whatever the application that you're trying to build. And as you move from proof of concept to production, you're trying to normalize across all of these dimensions. An interesting question that comes up from a lot of our customers is this idea of how should you think about the total cost of ownership for this entire software? And a lot of time and energy gets spent on model, API usage, and cost. By the way, these are just illustrative. But the idea is that there is a certain amount of cost for talent and development, for fine-tuning, for DevOps, and for operation support. None of which is, by the way, surprising in terms of any other software project. But generative AI adds a few other dimensions that doesn't exist. On the other side of it is not just that they're adding costs, but the benefits are also significantly higher because you're able to get a level of efficiency that you wouldn't have normally gotten with a traditional ML approach. I'd love to be able to say that almost every single AI project that we start ends in stellar results. But that's really not the case. And in a lot of those cases, what tends to happen is that when you don't really have the folks who are going to be using or benefiting very early on in the loop, helping you build it, helping you evaluate it, helping you understand when and why it's not working, if that trust isn't built, it actually results in a lot of conflict when you're trying to move from a production state, when you're trying to sort of get from a prototype state to a production. If you didn't have human in the loop, if you didn't really establish the right set of guardrails, it tends to cause a lot of issues because people have a natural mistrust for something that they're not able to completely explain or understand or how it actually interacts with what they're doing. In so many cases, we've seen this notion of people saying that, well, this thing is going to replace people and you're going to be able to displace certain sets of things. And we don't think of it that way. The way we think about it is that for 80% of tasks, the things that humans are doing, LLMs are way more efficient in doing this. But for the other 20% of tasks, it actually makes them superhumans in the sense that it really boosts the amount of creativity and their production that they can do. Which brings us to the last part of it. And then, so to scale, one of the things that tends to happen, I'll just focus on the first one because almost all the projects that we have sort of seen us do or our customers do is that when we start moving from a build phase where we are evaluating this product to be able to get it to production, our biggest challenges and the customers' biggest challenges is that what are the established guardrails, what are the processes that we have created that will continue to ensure that data continues to remain secure and remain private as new things are happening. There have been so many instances that you all have probably read about or seen where initially the results are really good, but then over a period of time, there isn't continued adherence to monitoring how it's being used, who's using it, what's the feedback, what's the right mechanisms. And to be able to make sure that the data is private and you have good feedback mechanisms has proven to be extremely crucial in making sure that these projects go from not just a nice to have, but something that can actually really help your customers. I want to end with 3 quick examples of companies who are actually doing this in real time and actually achieving really good results. Thomson Reuters did something very interesting. And one of the things that they did was very similar to one of the use cases that I talked about where they build tools for all of their employees. They built something known as Open Arena, which allows them to allow their employees to be able to test out multiple different aspects. And as a result of this, they were able to build and create, in 6 weeks, they were able to build something that allowed access to their employees on a variety of different dimensions to be able to experiment. And they're now seeing the benefit of this level of creativity. They're actually seeing a lot more projects that they didn't originally conceive of, which are coming from many different parts of the company, largely as a result of the investments to be able to democratize this within the company. Showpad is another example. It's a sales enablement company, and they used Amazon Bedrock to be able to train their own models. And one of the things that they did is, as a result, they started off with trying to say that, well, I want to be able to boost my customer productivity, but I want it to be able to link to assets. I want it to be able to link to my particular content. And they had a very specific goal of creating many different programs, largely to be able to help their salespeople boost productivity. And in a matter of a year, they picked a certain number, and they were able to get to about 12 of the, I think there were 12 out of the 14 items that they needed to be able to get done, all as a result of them sort of having a very clear vision of the specific areas where their processes needed the most amount of help and where they felt that LLMs could really help them. And then the last example is on BMW. And what BMW did was something interesting. They had supply chain planners spending a lot of time and energy pulling a lot of information and trying to be able to, they were spending 80% of their time pulling the information necessary in order to be able to create the content versus being able to do anything. So they used Amazon Q, they used QuickSight to be able to create the visuals necessary in order to be able to get from moving that 80% of time to be able to pull content to be 10% of the time, and they could actually build most of their data stories and their analysis largely using Amazon Q and Bedrock. There's 4 or 5 things that have sort of been talked about before, and I'll talk about this like very briefly. One of the interesting things about agents is this idea of being able to decouple very small, very specific, very tailored sets of things that can then go do specific tasks. They're operating now on not just on like different types of models, but also on highly multimodal content. And they're all increasingly aware of the different policies and standards that they need to get applied to, because you can actually train each agent with very different sets of things, because they are, and the ability for them to be able to coexist and work off of very specific content is becoming more and more useful. What used to be RAG before, what used to be knowledge bases, is now moving more into a very focused agentic development where agents are sort of being able to cooperate with each other. And we're seeing examples of this happen as we're speaking with most things that were sort of built using monolithic models are now breaking up into smaller models, which are then moving from not just a request response stuff to be able to sort of autonomously decompose a problem, break it up into its constituent parts, and to be able to solve it very easily using some of these aspects. And the key that comes up to there is how do they share data among them? And how do they make sure that as they're sharing data, you're sort of adhering to the policies and guidelines that you've exhibited for your original business? I'll end there. These are the 3 phases that we've sort of seen. It's helped our customers a lot. I hope this helps build as you go and sort of create products in your own company. Thank you so much.